What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Seven Figure Annuity Sales Podcast. It's Caleb North here this morning. And, today I wanted to talk about something that's come up in conversation with agents lately, and it's something we've talked about on the podcast before, but it's been a little while, and it's index allocation strategies. Okay, so selecting index strategies that you're actually going to use in your indexed annuities with your clients, and how to kind of navigate that process. Now, when it comes to index selection, allocation selection within an indexed annuity, I've made a statement before that I'm going to repeat again because I think this is the kind of the foundation of selecting the right strategy. And it's this: if you don't like the index itself outside of the annuity, you're probably not going to like it inside the annuity. I'll say it again. If you don't like the index itself outside of the annuity, you're probably not going to like it inside the annuity. What does that mean? That means that these index strategies that we have the ability to allocate funds to, you can see the track record and the historical performance of these indexes themselves. Okay, so removing them from the indexed annuity does two things. Number one, it removes the downside protection, the 0% floor that we have, and it removes the limiting factor, the crediting method, the rates, those types of things. So what you're able to do is see purely how that index performs or has performed historically. Okay. And historically is that's in today's day and age, that's kind of a loose term because now, a lot of these indexes that we see in these products are, they've been live for a year or two, or some of them mere months. And, the historical, and I use air quotes on that you're looking at is a back test. And it's not to say that back tests aren't designed to be pretty accurate, but it definitely raises questions when you see an index perform extremely well in a back test and then in live years, it's an absolute flop. And I've seen that happen on numerous occasions. So, personally, I'm really, the longer that I do what I do at working with agents and helping agents navigate product selection and index allocation, uh, the bigger fan I become of the S&P 500. And for me personally, there's a couple of reasons behind it. Number one, it's a household name. Okay, I mean everybody knows the S&P 500. Like, let's think through this practically for a second. If you're a client and your general understanding of how this indexed annuity product functions is when the market's up, I get a portion of the gains. When the market's down, I stay flat. If that's kind of your general understanding of how this works, what do I think the market is? Generally, people synonymize the S&P 500 with the overall performance of the market. So using some volatility-controlled index that has a blend of equities and commodities and cash, fixed income, it's like that's, for most people, not a good representation of the market. So if I see that index that's a multi-asset index, again, having equities, bonds, cash, commodities, whatever that blend is for me to be able to hit some specific volatility target in that volatility controlled index, I don't synonymize that with the market. And clients don't synonymize the performance generally of commodities and bonds with the market. So if that's their understanding, by using an index that uses those asset classes as components of the index that will affect the performance of the index and subsequently affect what they're able to credit in their annuity, you're setting yourself up to have a challenging conversation with a client when equities go on a tear and the other asset classes that index is exposed to don't perform, and now their return is not what they were expecting it to be based on their perception of what the market did. And again, I use air quotes on that. So using something like the S&P 500 is a good way to make sure that the way things are being credited in their policy are generally aligned with their understanding of what's going on in the market. The other thing you have to remember from a client returns standpoint is that we're dealing with point-to-point time periods, okay? Not annual, January 1st to December 31st time periods like get published, okay? So for example, when we look at the history of the S&P 500 and we look at historical annual returns of the S&P 500, we're looking at January 1st to December 31st of a year. But if you have a client that has an effective date on their policy of June 1st, that's the start of a point-to-point period for that crediting period. They're not going to credit interest based on January 1st to December 31st. They're going to credit interest based on June 1st to June 1st of the following year or 2 years or however long that reset period is. So when we're having those conversations with clients, it's also important to recognize that we're not able to just say, oh, well, the S&P 500 was 20% positive between January 1st and December 31st of the year. Why didn't I get a good portion of that? When we look at the returns from, say, June 1st to June 1st, and we see a much more tempered return over that time period, or a better return. It can go both ways. But the point is, make sure when you're having those conversations with clients that you're showing them how what was credited was actually in alignment with what that index strategy did during that time period that it was, calculating interest from a point-to-point perspective. And again, those conversations generally go better when you're using an index that they consciously synonymize with the overall performance of the market, which traditionally is the S&P 500. So the baseline here is you've got to, truth be told, first select an index. Okay. And this is my criteria order. When I'm going through and I'm looking at how am I going to recommend an index allocation mix here, I usually pick indexes first. So don't get caught up on rates first. Look at the index first. If you don't like the index outside of the annuity, you're probably not going to like it inside the annuity, pretty much regardless of the rate that it has. Okay? And here's the other thing you need to understand. Rates are relatively similar based on the expected volatility of the index. Okay, let me explain what I mean by that. If you're looking at a product that has a volatility-controlled index, say it's targeting a 5% annual volatility, you might see a 200% participation rate right now. And you might look at that rate and think, oh, that's a way high participation rate. I'm getting double whatever that index does. That's incredible. Okay. You might also see in that product the S&P 500 with a 50% participation rate. Okay. How are we looking at these two through the same lens? Well, 200% of a 5% volatility target, if that index were to hit its target of 5%, is effectively a 10% return. The S&P 500 generally is priced at about a 20% expected volatility. So if it hits its expected volatility of 20, let's say, and you have a 50% participation rate, what's 50% of 20? 10. So while the rate on one strategy might be 4 times higher, if the expected volatility of the index is 4 times lower, that's how they're coming to that number. It's a behind-the-scenes pricing thing that takes place between the counterparties that the insurance companies take their options budget to, and they bid out, they basically auction off, in essence, this options budget to these counterparties that then take that options budget and are able to apply that budget to a price, index call options that they're able to get on these different indexes. And that's how the formula of the rates are being calculated. So when you look at a product that's got a 200% participation on one strategy and a 50% participation rate on another strategy, it's not that that carrier is somehow giving you more expected return on one strategy. Their option budget in that product is the same. It's how far does that option budget go based on the price of those index options. Okay. So don't look at rates first and think, oh, well, I've got a better rate on this strategy, I'm somehow going to get a better return. No, you've got to consider the index first. Okay, so once we've considered the index and we've determined, okay, I like this index, this index, this index in this product. Great. Now what we're going to do is we're going to actually look at crediting methods and rates kind of together. So crediting methods being, another way you could think of it is kind of like your limiting factor. So I've got caps, I've got par rates, I've got performance triggers, I've got inverse triggers, I've got monthly sum, I've got monthly average, I've got, all these different types of ways that interest can be calculated. Now, here's what I'll say. There are real scenarios in which some of the more complex crediting methods can outperform simpler crediting methods. And when I say simpler, I'm talking about caps and par rates. Caps and par rates are about as easy as it is to explain to a client. I think next on that would be performance triggers. And then I think, more complicated, you get into the monthly sum and, the monthly average and those types of things. Can you, on the more complicated crediting methods, end up in a scenario where you have a greater return? Yes, you can. It's a specific recipe that is needed over the course of the crediting period for that to occur. And it doesn't typically occur, though it can. Okay, I've seen some of these, monthly average, monthly sum type things, crediting just astronomical annual returns in a very specific type of market where that index had consistent positive returns month over month. Okay. So can you get to that? Absolutely. Does the upside potential of those outweigh the risk of a lower credit and the complexity of the explanation to the client? Personally, I don't think so. Okay. So for me, I'm really liking cap rates and participation rates because they're simple, they're easy to understand, they're easy to explain, they're easy to show a client how they credited what they credited in an annual review based on the movement and the performance of the index that it's associated with during that point-to-point period. It makes life simple, and when you consider the rates across all the strategies available in a product, you're not really taking a hit on the crediting potential, okay? Again, can those more complex crediting methods have, years where they outperform caps and par rates? Sure, but it's not going to be every year, and they're more complicated to explain. As a result, I recommend using caps and participation rates. Again, simple, easy to calculate, easy to understand. No problem. When you tack a good cap and a good participation rate onto a household name index like the S&P 500, you're really setting yourself up for two things. Number one, in the years where equities perform, you're going to have some nice credits. That's just the way it's going to be. You're going to see some nice returns. And you're setting yourself up for better, easier client conversations with those people because they actually understand what they're in, what they're allocated to, and how it works. If we go to the extremes of all the complexities and the convolutions, I think we're actually doing what we're able to do with our products, which is bring simplicity and peace of mind, we're doing that a disservice, right? Like, if they want complex, let them go read a prospectus, okay? We don't have that. We don't need that. If that's what somebody's really interested in, then probably the safety and the security, that 0% floor of an indexed annuity with the upside potential is not what they're after from an accumulation standpoint, a growth standpoint, right? But for those individuals that do like that 0% floor, they want that downside protection. They're okay with foregoing some of the upside potential to have that protection. They're looking for maybe a bond alternative for a bond portion of their portfolio with a little bit more upside than what a typical bond would be able to provide. Great. But we can keep it simple. We can keep it easy to understand. We can keep it, household name, and put our clients into a situation that they actually understand what's going on with their strategies. Okay. The next thing we're going to get to is rates here. Okay. And, selecting rates is one of those things where can you end up with a little bit better rate on a strategy based on pricing of that strategy? Absolutely. So what you need to think about is kind of the trade-off between the rate and the implied volatility of the index. And again, we're gonna most of the time see some pretty similar pricing on these index rates based on the rate we actually can offer a client and the implied volatility of the index. But it is something worth looking at, right? For example, if I've got a volatility controlled index, which again, I've kind of on one hand said, I'm not directly saying don't use them. I think there are good volatility controlled indexes, but I've been kind of carrying on about the S&P 500. Here's the deal. Volatility controlled indexes are going to perform better in years where whatever those other asset classes that they have outperform equities. So if equities are down and you've got bonds, cash that are looking positive, or you've got commodities that are looking good, whatever it is that they're exposed to that helps to create that volatility control, when those outperform equities and equities are negative, you're going to have the potential for better returns in your volatility controlled indexes. And we're not going to pretend to speculate what the market's going to do because nobody knows. Okay. So don't go out there thinking you're going to tell your client what's going to actually perform, because you don't know. Nobody does. Okay. But all that said, if you look at history, we're generally seeing equities outperform other asset classes. So in a majority of years, will we see better returns out of an equities-based index like the S&P 500? Yeah, we should. Okay, that's kind of the way to think about it. But if you're going to be looking at these volatility-controlled indexes, assess the volatility target. Okay. For example, there are volatility controlled indexes that are targeting up 12% volatility, a 10, a 7, 5, right? There's kind of, they're all over the map. And what you'll see is the higher that expected or that volatility target goes, the lower the rate drops. Why? Because that index is structured and built in a way to target a higher volatility percentage on both ends of the spectrum, up and down. Now, here's the deal. We could argue preference all day long. I'll be forthright and tell you, we're in indexed annuities with a 0% floor. In my humble opinion, and it is purely an opinion, when we have a 0% floor, we can effectively have an index that has as much volatility as we can possibly get. And here's my logic behind it. The more volatility an index has, are you going to see a lower rate? Yes. But that index movement is what creates for us both really nice positive returns and lower troughs in the negative years to reset in. Here's what I mean. If the S&P 500, for example, has, say, a 20% implied volatility or expected volatility, though Again, remember, it is not managed to a specific volatility, right? We're not using the the S&P 500 is not targeting a specific amount of volatility. It's going to do whatever those stock prices do based on their weighting in that index. So, because we have a 0% floor, if that index goes on a tear because it's unmanaged, it's not volatility controlled, great. That's fantastic for us, both in caps and participation rates. If it drops a ton, great. We have a 0% floor, but now we're setting an even lower index price in our reset so that as that index merely tries to climb back up to where it was, dropped, we're going to be able to credit positive interest as it recovers, not just once it recovers and beyond. So I like personally a lot of volatility in my index strategies. Which again, kind of comes back to using an equities based index like the S&P 500. Um, but there are instances where, from a pricing standpoint, you can get perhaps a better deal on the expected volatility or the volatility target of a vol control index. Let's say, for example, you've got a 10% cap on the S&P 500, but that same product has a 120% participation rate, and that on an index that has say a 10% volatility target. Is that index going to hit the 10% volatility target every time? No, it's not. Okay. Some years it's going to be higher. Some years it's going to be lower. Some years it's going to be negative. That's just the reality. We're not going to hit 10% every year. That is the target for that annual volatility. So what that means is that if it were to hit its expected volatility of, say, 10%, and I have a 120% participation rate, what's my effective credit to the strategy or from the strategy? 12%. If in that same product I've got the S&P 500 priced at, say, a 20% expected volatility, and I have a 10% cap, if it hits its expected volatility, great, I got 10%. The difference is that in a cap strategy, and a better way to probably look at that would be to assess a participation rate. Let's say it was a 50% participation rate in the S&P 500 with a 20% volatility. That's kind of the way it was priced, was at a 20% expected volatility. And I've got a 120% on a 10% volatility controlled index. 50% of 20 is 10, 120% of 10 is 12. So can you find kind of these pricing anomalies where the rate that you get on a particular strategy based on the expected volatility or the implied volatility or the volatility target, whatever you want to call it, based on that rate and that volatility target, can you find those kind of pricing anomalies where you can end up with a little bit better credit? Absolutely. Okay. So when I say we're going index first, crediting method second, rates third, that's what I'm talking about. Okay. So you're going to start looking at these products through the lens of, what are these indexes that I like? Then what are the crediting methods that I like? And based on those, and you're going to get it whittled down. I mean, some of these products have 15 different strategies in them. You might get it down to, man, I like these 2 indexes and these, 3 crediting methods. And then from there, you're able to look at the rates and see, okay, well, this one has, a relatively a better participation rate for the index than this one does. So I'm going to use that one. And this one's got a better cap relative to the index for this one. So I'm going to use some of that. And you can create your allocation mix by whittling it down one step at a time. And you're using these 3 criteria as a checklist to eliminate strategies. Does it mean you're going to get it right every time? No. But remember, nobody knows what the market's going to do. All we're trying to do is apply due diligence to the way we're allocating client funds. And here's the last thing I'll say. This is a client decision. Sometimes agents will come in and they'll just put down what they want to put. And from a legal standpoint, that is not the way it's supposed to go. It's supposed to be done in conversation with the client. The client is signing off on the application that, yeah, these are the strategies I want to allocate to. Well, if you go in there and you put something and you haven't talked to them about it, discussed how it works, anything like that, and they're agreeing, oh yeah, that's not a good situation to find yourself in. So you want to have these conversations with clients. And if you are going to make some kind of recommendation per se, which kind of honestly toes the line of advice, which you're going to want to be careful about. If you're going to be having these conversations with clients, make sure you can articulate how they work so that y'all can come to a conclusion and a decision together, and the client understands the allocation that they're in, and they like that strategy. Because then 1 year later, 2 years later, whatever that reset period is, you come back to them, you have a conversation, you're reiterating the things they already understand, not explaining something new to them. So this is the recipe for two things: better client conversations and the likelihood for better, more consistent types of returns. Again, are you going to have the highest return every single year based on your allocation strategies? No. But can you create more confidence? Can you create more consistency? Can you create more likelihood for returns? Yes. And it's not based on looking at the index historical back-tested returns inside the annuity based on current rates. That's just not how we're going to do it. We're not going to go in there and say, oh, well, this index is credited 12% on average over the last 10 years, so that's what I'm going to use. No. Look at the index, look at the crediting method, look at the rates. If you don't like it in that order, don't be moved by what that illustration says the back-tested historical illustrated returns are, because we know that those are about as inaccurate as they can be. So I hope it doesn't feel like I'm frustrated. I'm not frustrated. I'm just passionate about this topic. I'm passionate about agents doing this the right way. And there's too many IMOs out there, too many marketers that are out there telling, oh yeah, look at this is averaged, whatever. And it's like, that's just not the reality of the way this product is going to function. So like your index first, like your crediting method second, and select from those based on your rates third. So I hope this helps you. Always value the, it's renewal rate integrity. So place a high value on that with your clients that are looking at these strategies for accumulation. But all the methods that I just shared today, they can be applied to income products as well. Anything index related, indexed annuity for, preservation and accumulation, or indexed annuities with income riders for guaranteed lifetime income, you can apply these crediting method strategies to both sides of the spectrum. So I hope this helps you. And as always, happy selling.